the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, February hardcover and trade paperbacks are in. Plus, we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of Timothy Zahn's Cobra, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I am Baen Associate Editor and your podcast host, David Afshirod. Today, Sean Patrick Hazlett talks with editor David Boop and contributors Walter John Williams, Hank Schwabel, Brenda Cooper, and Ken Scholes about High Noon on Proxima B, a new anthology of space western stories. But first, the news. The February hardcovers and trade paperbacks are in. Let's take a look. First up, we have What Price Victory, edited by David Weber. The mission: to boldly explore David Weber's honorverse and to deliver all the action, courage, daring do, and pulse-pounding excitement of space naval adventure with tales set in a world touched by the greatness of one epic heroine, Honor Harrington. New Honorverse stories by Timothy Zahn and Thomas Pope, Jane Lindskold, the Honorverse Czech translator Jan Kotek, and Joel Presby, plus First Victory, an all-new novella by David Weber. New Honorverse tales by Timothy Zahn and Thomas Pope, Jane Lindskold, Jan Kotek, and Joel Presby, plus First Victory, an all-new novella by David Weber. Next up, we have High Noon on Proxima B, edited by David Boop. It's always high noon somewhere. Adventure, danger, revenge, and a mail-order robot gunslinger in a wedding dress? Only in the wildest parts of space could this happen. It's time again to get in your ramshackle rocket ship and journey to the universe's western territories with this follow-up to Gunfight on Europa Station. 10 Tales of the West. Not as it was, but as it might be. And Dead Man Walking by Simon R. Green. Ishmael Jones is called in to solve the mystery of a rogue secret agent who came in from the cold to spill all he knew, only to end up murdered in detention. Then his body goes missing. Then other people start dying. Has the murdered agent risen from the dead to get his revenge? How can all this be happening in one of the most secure interrogation centers? As Ishmael and his partner Penny dig deeper into what's really going on, secrets are revealed and horrors are uncovered. But so many people are dying, they have to wonder if anyone will be left to reveal the answer to. That's What Price Victory, High Noon on Proxima B, and Dead Man Walking, all available now. And that's it for the news.
I am here with David Boop and company to discuss High Noon at Proxima Bravo or B, depending on how you want to say it. I like Bravo, but as part of the Baen Free Radio podcast. So before we get started, I just want to go around the horn and have each of the authors and editors, the editor, introduce themselves and just a quick bio of who you are and how you got involved. So David, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm David Boop. I'm a Denver-based author and editor. This is my 5th anthology for Baen. I did 3 Weird Westerns first, and then this is my 2nd space Western. The first was Gunfight on Europa Station, which came out last year. And just continuing on with the theme. I just know too many good authors that write this stuff. And honestly, I can't get enough of reading their stories. So hopefully you guys can't either, because there's another one after this one. So
outstanding.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, David. Ken Scholes.
Yes, my name is Ken Scholes. I am a science fiction and short story, primarily a short story writer out in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm better known, oddly enough, for my 5 novels that comprise the Psalms of Isaac, published by Tor. and available from Amazon and Audible and all those places. I've been writing in print for about 23 years. I also split time as a singer-songwriter, so I stay a little busy, and I've slowed down a little bit. But anytime David Boop comes to me and says, "Excuse me, sir, but could you please write me some weird Scholesian thing?" I'm going to pretty much say yes to David. So I'm here today with great delight because he once again asked me to play baseball on his team.
All right. Well, thank you, Ken, and welcome. Walter John Williams.
Hi, I've been doing this a while. I've been supporting myself as a writer for over 40 years, and I've written over 40 volumes of fiction, some of it you see behind me here. That is the Praxis, my operatic space series, I guess you'd call it. And I'm probably best known for the novel Hardwired, which came out over 30 years ago and is still my best-selling book. But I recommend any of my stuff to you, including the story I have for this anthology.
Outstanding. Hank.
Hi, I'm Hank Schwabel. I write primarily horror, but I do occasionally write science fiction stories. I got into this anthology through a mutual contact with David, who I guess recommended me, and David reached out, and I was very happy to do it because Westerns, science fiction, I mean, that's all you had to say, space Western, and I was there. I've written mostly novels if you look at how long I've spent doing them, but I've got a collection out now, and I've written a prior collection, and I've written 4 novels, and I tend to keep busy with short stories in between my novels, mostly horror though.
All right, thanks, Hank. Cliff.
Hi, I'm Cliff Winnig. I'm a California-based, so I live in the West, science fiction fantasy writer. This is my second time appearing in one of David Boop's anthologies. I was also in Straight Outta Deadwood. And I got into it because David asked me to send him a story for that. And he apparently liked it because he bought it and then asked me to be in this. So here I am. I have a number of other stories out in various places, including the Escape Pod podcast, a story called The Call of the Sky, which anyone can listen to if they like or read online. And I also, like Ken, am a musician. I play sitar, which is why I moved to California to study with the great Indian music maestro Ali Akbar Khan many years ago. And I'm still here.
So I'm going to correct you there for a moment, Cliff, because that's not what happened.
Oh, no.
What happened was that I mentioned at a convention what the title for the second book was.
Well, I was going to get to that specific when we talk about my
and
story.
He said, I already have a story for you just on that title. I wasn't really given much of a choice.
To be fair, you said you were going to have me in the third book.
Okay, well,
so you're going to have me in one of them.
Yeah.
There's got to be a story behind that, but I'm not going to push it.
There is, and when we get to my story, I'll tell you.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome, Cliff.
Thank you.
Brenda, last but not least.
All right. Hi. Like Ken, I'm also from the Pacific Northwest. I'm a technologist, a futurist, and a writer, mostly of science fiction, often climate fiction. I do a lot of short fiction. My most recent short fiction piece came out in Anthropocene magazine in December. I had the piece out in Slate last year, so you can find a lot of my short fiction online pretty easily. I do have a number of novels. I haven't had a novel out for a couple of years, mostly because I've been busier working on the futuring side of my world, and unlike some of you folks, I still have a day job. So, that I work in IT and construction, which is just a total blast, and I love it. So, and I love writing, and I was really happy to be invited into this anthology, and it was fun to be part of it.
Thank you, Brenda.
All right. I'm a lawyer by day. I just don't like telling people. That's embarrassing.
We won't hold it against you. Can we?
Well, we might. We might. All right,
David. It was an honor that these guys responded to my call. I mean, every one of them. I've read their works, and they're just amazing. And especially getting to work with Walter, after reading so much of his stuff over the years, he's like, I can check that one off of a list of people I wanted to work with. And he gave me an amazing story. So
Oh, well,
I'm
thank you.
very happy.
All right, so David, you've done, this is kind of your 5th anthology for Baen. I think I think all of them are about the West in some form, right? And this one is the 2nd in kind of the space Western genre. How did this come about, and how is it different from the last one?
So, what happens is sometimes you look at what you've produced and you say, what's the logical progression from there, right? So I did the weird Westerns, which were all Earth-based, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were all, set here in the past. And I'm like, the Western thing is certainly something that I'm known for. I've written a lot. My new novel is a weird Western and everything like that. So I wanted to continue with that theme, but I just didn't want to do another 3 weird Westerns. I could have easily filled it, especially with some of these guys, but I wanted to look at how do I, evolve this to the next level. And so what I pitched to Tony was basically, we're off to outer space. We're leaving planet Earth. She liked it, and Jim liked it, and everybody liked it. And, so I put together the first one. And the first one was interesting because, of course, I'm editing space Westerns for the first time, right? I've edited some science fiction, and I've edited, pretty much everything at some point, pulp heroes and so forth. But space Western, which has more in common with like space opera than it does weird Western, meant that I had to kind of change my approach when looking at the stories, specifically regarding the idea of science, right? With a weird Western, which is mostly fantasy based, even though you can have science fiction, especially steampunk and so forth in there, I had to make sure that the authors that were giving me the stories knew that I wanted believable science. I didn't want, hand waving. I didn't want just fantasy science, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted stuff that actually potentially could happen. And the question was that I posed to all of them is space the final frontier, right? What is it like? What are we going to encounter out there? Less from a science fiction television show, less from a space movies and things like that. I wanted to explore what life on that frontier would be like, and it was well received. Coming into the second one, I had a better idea of the type of stories that people liked in the first one, and I aimed more towards that. And usually with my second anthologies, I tend to go a little darker. I don't know that I necessarily went darker, but I definitely went harder on this one. And I'm really happy with how it came out. And people who have pre-read it and reviewed it so far seem to have been as well. So something's working.
All right, my friend, that's a great introduction. So let's start with the first story here, which is High Noon on Proxima Bravo B. I don't know what you want to call it, Cliff, but it is the namesake.
Would say B.
It is the namesake of the entire anthology. So tell us a little bit about the story and the characters.
Well, David is correct. I did kind of grab him by the lapels when I learned the title of this book and say, I have an idea for this story. So I have the title story only because I liked the title and wrote and pitched a story, and David liked that. And there you go. So the idea is, Proxima Centauri B is a real planet that we have discovered by the so-called wobble method, which I'm not going to get into, but It's in the habitable zone around the star Proxima Centauri, which is cooler than our star. It's a red dwarf. So the habitable zone works out that it's got an 11.2 day orbit. So it's very close, which means the planet is either something like Mercury in a resonance orbit, or something like our moon and tidally locked with one side facing the sun all the time. And I thought, ooh, what if it's tidally locked? Then high noon is a place and not a time. And so I made the town of high noon on the planet Proxima Centauri B. And that town is very hot and unpleasant, but is also the solar energy collecting farm for the whole planet. And it then sends the energy to the more reasonably temperate cities in the twilight, and then a city called Midnight on the far side. And my protagonist, Jocelyn Stark, is the unfortunate unfortunately, the town marshal of High Noon. And she rides an 8-legged sand lizard, and she has to deal with 3 killers arriving by train at the beginning of the story. And that's the setup. So it's kind of a third Western, a third hard science fiction, and a third planetary romance, like John Carter of Mars kind of thing, all mixed together into one story.
What were some of the challenges in developing the plot when reconciling the facts of, or the hard science fiction aspect? So, you know, how did you decide on flora and fauna with a world that has a twilight zone, a dark zone, and then a high noon zone, psychological factors of, you know, sun never setting, essentially? Talk through a little bit of that as you're trying to come up with a narrative for it.
Sure. Well, the hardest challenge was making the planet habitable, and making that part of the planet habitable. I had to give it a pretty good magnetic field to get rid of, you know, charged particles that would irradiate the surface. I had to put in some serious high winds that would distribute the heat. All of these are possible, but not necessarily true of the real planet. But it needed to hold on to a breathable atmosphere. And so I made most of the life on the planet in that band that the story doesn't take place in. The sand lizards evolved in the twilight area, and other megafauna and flora that did. So the high noon area is basically a desert. It's a very kind of Barsoomian kind of landscape, right? It's very like our Mars. And so once I had worked out like how to give this planet a viable ecosystem with multicellular life, that was most of it. And then I just had to blend in the other elements that I wanted for the story and make that work. And so I had a lot of fun, like creating the few bits of lore about that planet, life form, and ecosphere that I needed for the story. I didn't need to actually work out the entire ecology of the whole planet, because mostly we're in this sort of desert environment where normally there isn't a lot of large life forms, but it's not toxic or anything like that. So and then I had to kind of work out the economics of why, in a world where there's no faster than light travel, we would bother to send enough people to the Proxima Centauri system to colonize it. And it worked out to giant mining corporations that had already been mining the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt, and maybe even a little of the Oort cloud. And once you're already out there, from our Oort cloud to whatever Oort cloud surrounds Proxima Centauri, it's not such a ridiculously long distance. So it was all these, these mining giants that got people out there. And so there's a theme that's like the Western theme, like how gold got, you know, miner 49ers out to California. The mining mostly doesn't take place on Proxima Centauri B. It mostly takes place in the asteroid belt of that system, but they needed a place for people to live, and people, you know, and with a decent gravity well, so that your bone density stays up and things like that. And all of that is it's there, and it's what I call the scaffolding for the story. It's not
Mhm.
in the story, but it's how I built the world so that it makes sense to the reader.
And any key takeaways you want people to come out of the story with after reading?
Well, there are some themes that I noticed after I finished that kind of got in there.
That's basically the way it always is, right?
Right? Like, themes are what the academics tell me my story was after I'm done with it.
Yeah.
So I noticed that there is a sort of an anti, corporation theme in Westerns, a lot of Westerns. And I figured that out by writing this one. So my protagonist is that kind of individualistic person who really doesn't like other people all that much and really hates rich people and really hates big major corporations. And High Noon is kind of an independent town. It's not run by any particular corporation. It's neutral territory. So that's why she puts up with the heat and everything else. But unfortunately, the person she's going to have to, or the people, I should say, there's two people that she has to try and save from the 3 gunslingers who are arriving by train, are in fact related to the trillionaires who run one of the mining corporations. So she has to get out of her comfort zone right away and try and protect these trillionaires from other trillionaires who are wanting to do what is in the Proxima system a hostile takeover, which usually involves actual hostilities. So, because it is the Wild West in space.
All right, outstanding. All right, let's go to our the next story, The Planet and the Pig. Brenda, talk us through it. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
It's on Zoom where you're muted.
Lower left part of the screen.
So sorry, working with 2 screens and not in my regular office and all of that. So, all right, Planet and the Pig. All right, so to start out with, I set it there because I have a couple of books that are set in this sort of phenomenal extra solar system where there are only 2 planets and neither of them have very many people on them. And most of the people actually live in orbital machines. They live inside of large robots. They live inside of asteroids that have been hollowed out, that sort of thing. And the planet's not very peopled because essentially it was destroyed kind of in the way that we're trying, I think, potentially to do that to Earth. And then it was turned into a place where people are trying to preserve it, to help it. And of course, a lot of the bad people are going to want to go in and say, hey, I want to get into this preserve. I want to do the things I'm not supposed to do. I want to get in trouble. I had this lovely character named Charlie Windar, who I absolutely adore, who's a ranger. I wanted to give him a role. And I wanted to have a damsel in distress. I thought a damsel in distress was probably a good thing to put in a Western. So I started with a damsel in distress. My heroine is a mother who is on her own, trying to survive in this reasonably brutal environment. She gets caught by some fairly bad people who put her up to attempting to do what really ends up being a mistake, but they basically trick her into trying to do something in order to earn their trust. And I don't want to say much more, because if I say much more in the story, it might make it a little bit less fascinating to finish. But I love the planet. I love the place it's set on. I love the world that it's set in. And I think it was important sometimes to have something from a female point of view in a Western series. I haven't got through all the stories, but most of them are not. So I think are the ones that I've read so far. So I thought that was something I wanted to add to this as well.
Same question I posed to Cliff, which is there's actually a lot of varied flora and fauna in this particular planet. How did you come up with that? I want to say it was like 0.9 the gravity of, I'm probably getting Earth. So how did that play in? How did that play in, and how did it, among other factors, determine how you came up with some of the flora and fauna for the planet?
Well, it's very rich, very fecund, very wild. It's very wet. It's a wet planet. You saw there were rivers and streams and things like that on it. There's a lot of variety. Similar, I think, to what more wilder parts of, say, the Amazon or some of the other places on the Earth that are largely jungle would look and feel like. And I really just built it on being Earth, but different enough from Earth that you would know you were in a different place. So that's why I didn't give it like half a gravity. I've written that kind of thing before. But on this particular planet, I'm trying to simulate a little bit of what a place as beautiful as where we live might look and feel like. And then, of course, I gave it some new stuff. And there's some pretty big predators there, too, which is kind of fun. There's some nasty predators. In fact, there's lots of nasty predators on this planet. So that makes it a little hard for humans to deal with it.
Yeah, there's a little, I mean, without giving too much away, there's a little bit of luck too, vis-a-vis that.
Yeah.
So in terms of kind of themes in this particular story, what would you say are the most dominant ones?
I think if there's themes here, they're family and how important family is and how important hope is. And caring. I mean, in a way, it's an act of caring that helps ultimately resolve the issues that show up in the story for the family. And it's an act of caring for a wild thing.
All right. And anything you want to leave readers with, what should they kind of come away with after they finish reading it? What would you hope that they would come away with?
I would hope they came away with the idea that there are beautiful places both here and potentially in the other places that we might travel to in some far future.
Hopefully it's sooner rather than later. All right, Ken, let's talk a little bit about Harley taking on a wife.
Yeah, well, here we go.
It gets a little bit of a surprise in the beginning, but I'm not going to give any more away than that. So talk us, how did you come up with that?
Well, I kind of did the opposite of what Cliff and Brenda did, because I didn't do any science or any thinking about any of that. I'm kind of a social science fiction writer. Yeah. So of everybody in this, I haven't read everything in this book, but I'm almost always willing to bet that I'm the most black box science guy you'll ever find, given that I'm probably the only recovering Southern Baptist preacher in the room who disbelieved all of his science all through his educational track until he was out of college and got some therapy. But so my story is really about loneliness, and it's about Harlan Roscoe Sussbauer. I live not far from Sussbauer Road, actually. Things in my life end up in my stories. But Harley Sussbauer is lonely. And we state the problem right there in that first paragraph, like they tell us short story writers we got to do. He's lonely. He's out of sorts. He needs companionship. He knows there's a problem. And of course, he's practical. So he gets a plant first. And things just kind of keep going wrong from there. And
by the way, I don't know if it was meant to be this way, but every time that Cactus speaks, I think in the voice of John Wayne. I don't know if
yes, I did that to you with a clever trick by calling him Duke
Pilgrim.
And Daisy, later we had Daisy, right? But yeah, as a matter of fact, if this were ever turned into a rom-com, Duke and Daisy would be the narrators of it, right? Because you've got that whole down home country. I think Publisher Weekly called it a campfire tale. And so, I mean, I don't know. I was in a mood. I'm an old single dude that's dating in the world. And I started thinking about the olden times and mail order rides, and I knew that I probably wasn't going to be able to get anywhere with that these days. So I just write a story about it, and all the things that could go wrong. And of course, it's also a caper story, and it's a little bit of a romance story. I'm hoping it's one of the weirdest of the weird space Western stories that David's collected, so that he'll keep asking me to throw weird stories on his pile. But I don't know, it's a delight to write it. I find a voice, I find a character that I want to explore, and then I just go for a ride.
Can I
Yeah,
add
you definitely don't see the end coming, but once you read it, everything led up to that point, and it makes sense.
Thank you.
Can I add a tiny bit to that? I read that story out loud last night to my partner at home, and I read the cactus parts in John Wayne's voice. I just have to say that, because there was no other way to do it.
There isn't. I mean, you right down to him being a little bit of a prick. I mean, so was I not allowed to say that on the podcast? He's a cactus.
Fine. No, it's a cactus, so it's allowed.
He's a cactus. He's sharp and pokey.
Yeah. So I have to ask, Ken, before you started dating again, did you get a cactus?
I did better than that. I got a succulent. Well, aren't cactuses a type of succulent? I don't know. But I got something that just you couldn't kill. It's like right above plastic. But I also got cats, and obviously I still don't, I'm not all partnered up, so I'm still experimenting. As a matter of fact, I just got some paper plates, and I'm trying that now. And so.
I got cheese balls.
Those are cheese balls.
Plates, so
Okay. Now, what would you want? I know you talked about kind of the loneliness, and by the way, that's kind of a theme so far, right? Between Cliff's story, even Brenda's story, you have a kind of a family in this big, broad planet with lots of space. And then Ken, definitely, especially with the, and I don't know in the very beginning if all the things you threw at your character were actually trying to cure loneliness or to make him crave more of it, but I'll just leave the audience with that.
Right. Well, I just love getting the opportunity to tell these weird stories. And, I didn't know exactly where it was heading when I got in the car. I just had a rough notion, and that it was going to be weird. But yes, well, thank you.
Well, and let me just sound off on that whole loneliness thing. By quoting one of our predominant theorists about space, and that would be Douglas Adams, where he said space is big, really big. So yes, that's kind of what we were going for, is how big space is and what it does to people.
All right, speaking of how big space is, Warlock Rules. Hank.
Yes.
I don't know if it'll be permissible to say. I think you have to say the Chibulins, because I think the other one is a big no-no in your story.
Well, when I was invited to submit for this, I was told the title, and immediately I think, well, okay, I got to have a gunfight. I mean, this is high noon. I got to have a gunfight. So I was like, the challenge is, okay, how do you have a gunfight in the future without it being laser guns or something?
You have a lawyer write the story.
Well, see, that's the thing, because I, as a lawyer, only need to know enough science to bamboozle a jury. So that's not a whole lot. So I don't write hard sci-fi. I know my limitations there. And it would come across as phony anyway. But, you have to create a believable environment, a believable context and setting. So I gave it some thought. And I thought, if we're in a futuristic setting out in space, what would be a circumstance where you would have to go retro? And as you know, Sean, warfare is not always symmetrical. And if you have a conflict in space, it could be where one side is much more technologically advanced, but the other side has other, intrinsic abilities to hold their own. So
like fine motor skills.
Things like that, yes. And in this case, they were very concerned, the other side, about human technology. And so for enforcement of their treaty, they wanted to they believed that you had to have some kind of ultimate trial by combat entry, but they didn't like our technology, so they made it to where you had to use weapons from hundreds of years earlier if you were going to do it. And so, I was a little worried that would be too contrived, but as I was fleshing it out, I thought it seemed to work, given that you have a very alien, no pun intended, culture you're dealing with. So, so then I had, a predicate there for a gunfight, and from there, the story was just forces at play where individuals, are swept up in it. They're pawns. Warfare is ugly. Competing interests, can roll over people and don't tend to care about individuals, and especially when lots of things are at stake. Lots of money, lots of power, lots of geopolitical implications, are all in play here. The single guy or woman, their lives don't amount to a hill of beans, as somebody famously once said. So, and so that's what I think emerged as the theme. I try not to let the theme control what I'm writing too much, because I want it to be character driven. If you let if I let the theme dictate, the story seems a little wooden, seems a little artificial, a little forced. So the themes emerge, I think in good writing, the themes emerge from your understanding of the characters and the conflict and the realistic portrayal, of the action there. The themes will come because we're surrounded by themes in life. There's a theme in everything we do, everything we're faced with, every challenge we have. We always take away a theme, but it's never a theme that you see in the beginning. It's always in retrospect that you understand the theme. And I think fiction should emulate that. So, the only theme I had really in mind here was just, here's a guy who is, because of an unusual set of circumstances, hundreds of years in the future here, going back to having to have a gunfight against an alien opponent. And that was really all I needed to set the stage here. The rest of it was just based upon my understanding, somewhat cynical, also worldview of geopolitical conflicts and the various interests at play, whether they be governmental or private, monetary, things like that.
And what is the one takeaway you'd want any reader to come out of that story with?
Well, some people's outlaws are other people's heroes, and the times change, and histories get rewritten or remembered differently, and you really can't always count on what's legal. You can't always count on what's mandated. You can't count on what institutions tell you. You've got to do what's right, and sometimes that could be considered cheating. Sometimes that could be considered unlawful or criminal. But that kind of context shifts. But what doesn't shift is who ultimately people who know the real story would side with. And so as facts emerge in history, villains have become heroes and heroes have become villains. And so that's why, I kind of had it play out the way it did. It's that, one man's outlaw is another man's hero, as they say.
All right. Very, very well said, my friend. Walter John Williams, Westworld, essentially Hollywood in the stars.
Yeah, pretty much.
I guess. Well, yeah. Let's. How did you come up with that?
Well, whenever I do a anthology, I try to think of what other people in the anthology are going to write, and then make sure I'm not going to do that, because I don't want there to be too much overflow or duplication going on. And so, the first thing that came to mind is I just take a classic Western film and I do a science fiction version of it. And then I thought, what Western film? And if anyone else does this, what if we pick the same Western? So anyway, I started thinking about cinema in the West. And then so my space Western has to do with a group of filmmakers in space trying to make a Western film. including having to import a bunch of horses from Earth, which then, due to an accident, end up in a zero gravity situation. So you have to have the wranglers wrangling horses that are floating around in space and aren't very happy about it, and they're kicking and kicking up a fuss, and there's a whole complicated scene about that. But most of the story is just about how you make a movie, especially making a movie on a subject that's, to these people, totally alien. They not only have to have the Western explained to them, they have to have West explained to them. At one point, the director's explaining his vision, and these people are going, what's West? Because there's no West in their space habitat. There's north and south. Yeah, they're two arbitrary directions, but east and west they don't have. They have upspin and downspin.
Even the lengthy, not lengthy, but even the discussion on this, there's this drive for verisimilitude in the film. But the question is what is the what are you trying to be true to? The cinema conception of the West or the actual conception? And I think the way that you illustrated it beautifully was the fact about the tumbleweeds.
The tumbleweeds, yeah.
I had no idea. I thought that was fascinating. But go ahead. I want the audience to hear this.
So because the director is influenced by classic Western films of yesterday, he wanted there to be tumbleweeds in his movie. And so, they had to print them up. And he was experimenting with the tumbleweeds and finding out how they tumble and how best to shoot them and stuff. And then realized, somebody told him, or he looked it up himself, he realized that there were no tumbleweeds in the Old West. They came up from Russia in like the 1890s, but it's actually a Russian thistle. That's the technical name for it, Russian thistle. And so then he had this horrible crisis of conscience. He was dedicated to total authenticity in this film, but he really wanted tumbleweeds to be there, even though they were inauthentic. And he's talking to the narrator, and the narrator is saying, well, it depends on whether you want to be authentic to the cinema or authentic to history. And goes into this long, that all of the films that have tumbleweeds in them, and there are a lot of good films that have tumbleweeds in them, and if you want to be authentic to them, you should feel free to put tumbleweeds in your movie. Which actually convinces the director to allow tumbleweeds in his film, although he has an enormous crisis of conscience over it, and he's agonizing for days because he's just that kind of guy.
Well, it's very Hollywood. It's extremely Hollywood.
Well, it's part of the story is what it's like to work for a genius. And my narrator, who is brand new to the business, and he's got, through connections, he's got a job as the second assistant director, which is an actual job you can have in Hollywood. Not the second assistant director, not the first assistant director, but the second assistant director. That's an actual job title. So he's got this rather ambiguous job, which essentially means anybody senior to him tells him what to do. And he's this director is one of his heroes, and of course you shouldn't meet your heroes, should you?
I don't know. I actually like hanging out with you, Walter.
Oh, thank you.
No, it's fascinating that we're talking about this, because a lot of us have written historical period pieces, and that's something that all of us as writers run into. And of course, as people who edit that also have to deal with the idea of the audience or the reader's conceived notion about what that period is like versus what it was actually like.
Yeah, I think Victorian historians have a lot to answer for.
Yes.
Every time I end up in a historical discussion, as well, so-and-so said this back in 1841, and that's the last word. Well, no, it's not the last word. Been a lot of words since then, but that one word is coming down over the last 100 odd years, has totally biased everyone's discussion, But yeah, it's so I threw in some facts about the Old West that aren't generally known, or actually they're known, but there's not been thought about. That one of the things is it was almost all young men. 90% of the population were young men. There were very few old people. There were very few women. And they were heavily armed young men And they were drunk all the time, which explains the high mortality rate. And this film is set in the late 1860s, and they hadn't invented the cowboy hat yet.
Oh yeah, I remember that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, what people were wearing in that time were bowlers or derby hats. And so, you know, picture cowboys in derby hats. That's what they wore, unless they were wearing Mexican sombreros or something. And the first Stetson had just been released, but it had a flat top and a flat brim, and it looked like a Zorro hat. And various other things, like what happens with black powder revolvers, where you're putting loose black powder down each of 6 cylinders and then tamping the bullet on top. And it turns out that the fire can spread really quickly. And so you can theoretically fire off all 6 cylinders at once.
Well, even the fast load, right? Where you take out the entire chamber and throw in another chamber to avoid having to go through that lengthy...
The entire cylinder,
Yeah.
Yeah, that was how you did speed loading in the 1860s.
Now, in terms
but
of
at any rate, I'm trying to, you know, weave this larger story about creation about it, and about people finding out about all this stuff and then having to cope with it. They have to import wranglers from Earth to look after the horses, and they have to bring a horse trainer to teach everyone how to ride. And there are the two protagonists of the film are a married couple who are going through a breakup as this film is being made. And one of them turns out to be a superb writer, and the other one can't write at all. And so there's, you know, just all of this conflict that happens. I really enjoy writing about Hollywood. I've done it several times, and there are very few people in our field who do that, because if they do get jobs in Hollywood, they don't want to lose these jobs by telling anyone the truth about anything. So, and I don't have a job in Hollywood, and I don't care. So I'm happily using all the stories that I've acquired over the years.
Yeah, I was about to ask that. How did you acquire that knowledge? Just people who were in the industry? Did you spend any time?
Well, I have done some work in film and TV, so part of it's that. But the other thing is, you know, I know a lot of people, you know, including that famous author that lives in Santa Fe, who spent a lot of time in Hollywood, and I know a lot of his friends, and I know various other people who've spent a lot of time out there, and they come back with the most amazing stories, but they're not about to write them.
I'm still crossing my fingers for a Hardwired movie one day.
Well, so am I. And in fact, if you know anyone with $200 million to spare, you know, give him my phone number.
Let me see what happens with the royalty check from this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there we go.
Right. Yeah. You know, because if this goes viral, you know, we could get to maybe 1/1,000,000th of that. So.
Now, what other themes would you want folks to take home from this, other than Hollywood is absolutely bonkers?
I think you know, in the bigger theme has to do with how you create art, and all of the obstacles that you have to do in order to do that. And that, you know, we tend to credit very few people with films. We credit the director. You know, if we're writers, we credit the writers. No one else does. And so. You know, and there's the auteur theory, and there are some directors who are auteurs who control just sort of literally everything on the production, but they also have to wrangle 200 people. You know, it takes an enormous amount of people to make a film, and you know, including, you know, the second assistant director who nobody knows what he does, right? And so it is a collaborative medium, and every time I've worked in film and TV, it has been a collaborative medium. I may be the only writer, but there's an awful lot of collaboration that goes on before you even start to write anything. Because you have to decide what to write and how to write and what's important about what you're writing and all of that. And then it evolves. And if you're in TV, the network appoints this guy who's in charge of saying no. He's the executive vice president in charge of saying no. And you come up with an idea, say, you know, I'd like to set this on an alien world. No, we can't afford an alien world, but it's a science fiction series. No, sorry, no. We set it on the Starship, which is the permanent set. Alien worlds are not on our budget. And I'm going, but yeah. Anyway.
Or it's an alien world that looks a lot like Vancouver.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, even doing a Western, they say, oh, horses?
Yeah.
Horses? Ooh, that's expensive.
And things can go wrong. I had
insurance.
One example of a TV show that I wrote, and it was just a casting mistake. They had cast the perfect person for it, but it turned out that she got work in a movie, so she couldn't do the TV show. So they had a last second casting thing, and apparently she did a really great audition, but then whenever they came to shooting it, she would freeze every time a camera was pointed at her. She couldn't remember her lines. They ended up just having her move her lips so that they could have another actress dub her lines and stuff. And so they had to do, I think it was 28 rewrites over a 10-day shoot to accommodate this problem and make sure that the camera was never on the guest star. And so, it was nobody's fault that this happened, but it ended up being a royal mess.
I don't know. I come from the kind of the military, right? It's the actress's fault because she can't say her lines. You're out.
Or the agent.
Yeah.
Presumably she didn't know that she couldn't say her lines. She may, anyway. I think she was fairly new. So
I would hope.
But I have this thing in my mind. If with the original cast, if the guest star had been the person that they originally cast with, it would have been awesome.
All right, let's go back to David. That was I could talk about this for hours, but we're gonna keep folks on track. So, David, are there any other stories you'd like to mention in this anthology or call out?
Oh, well, they're all wonderful, but what I like to do is get people who are known for this kind of thing, especially if they've got some media tie-in experience. And so I got Dayton Ward and Kevin Dillmore to give me a story, and of course they're well known for Star Trek and so forth, and these guys, I've known them for years. They come to Denver to the cons a lot. And I've known them for ages, and I've wanted to work with them. Actually, Dayton edited a story of mine for an anthology many years ago, and I wanted to return that favor. And getting him and Kevin Dillmore together for this project, it's usually one's available, but the other isn't, but they were both, and I'm like, yes, I was so happy to get them. And they brought a whole level of consciousness thing and AIs and so forth. Or is that the right one? No. Oh, they did. That was their story. Their story is about a soldier on the run. Sorry. I got a lot of stories in there. I can't remember which one goes to which person sometimes. But no, they gave a soldier on the run and hiding out on a small town in a outpost, and having that past come back to haunt them. That, and that's kind of a very Star Trek sort of thing, we're going to go visit a planet, and here is this person that's supposed to be dead and they're still alive and hiding out and so forth. So that one was really good. The AI was Milton Davis. He gave me a great robot revenge story. Can a robot that quote unquote doesn't have emotions, can it actually understand wanting revenge for the death of its owners, and who helps that robot achieve that level of understanding of a very human instinct So that story was really good. Thea Hutchinson gave us a story set in a space bordello. Much like Cliff, she sold me on the idea like right off the bat. She's like, yeah, space bordello. And I'm like, I want to see that story. And it ended up being a caper bit, not a comedy like Ken's, but actually quite serious. And I like, and oh, just so very good. So, and then Susan Matthews gives us a great, Susan R. Matthews, could throw the R in there, who's a Baen author. And she gave me a really good story about what is the cost of peace, right? Like, if peace means murder, is it worth it? And that's a question that runs through her story. So yeah, I mean, oh, and then Peter Wax gave me a kind of a steampunk space western and samurai film combination about a sentient airship who witnessed basically the end of a civilization and its own kind of role or accountability in that. So, you know, there's some elements of genocide and honor and things of that nature. So it's a very deep story. And I had read a much like a flash fiction version of this story many years ago. And I said, I want to see that longer, and asked him if he would be willing to revisit that story and plump it out and give it more of that kind of what happens on the outer rim when you leave certain people to their own, certain civilizations to their own devices without any sort of control in what happens. And so it's the story from this AI's point of view of what happens to its civilization that it's responsible for.
Now, when does your anthology come out?
Next week, Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. So,
and can folks buy the e-arc right now on Baen.com?
Yeah, they can buy the e-arc. They can order the trade paperback. It should ship day and date to them. Yeah, it's chock full of good stories. So it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you checked out the first one and liked it. This is more of that. And tend to do it one more time. That will be out sometime next year. And that is Last Train out of, you know, because I'm carrying over the Outa thing. Last Train out of Kepler 283c. And we have some great surprise authors in there for you.
All right, last question. Which story is your favorite? I'm just kidding. Don't answer that question.
Them's fighting words.
Yeah, I know.
Smile
all right,
when you say that.
Yeah.
We all love our children equally.
Yes.
Exactly. Even if we don't.
Now, once we stop recording, I'll actually do. But no, seriously, right. I have a blessing of riches when it comes to the authors I pick. And who respond, because, you know, I mean, I pick a lot of authors and they don't have the scheduling availability, but the ones who have the schedule always rise to the challenge that I ask them to, right? You know, is space a final frontier? That's the first question I asked every one of these guys. And every one of them said, how do we answer that? And they did. They did excellently. And I always say in my emails to them, you have honored me by your words. And hopefully you'll feel honored if you, the audience out there, chooses to read it, because these are brilliant stories.
All right. So I think by next week, so right now it is February 1st. This will show up, I think, sometime later this week.
Yeah. So it's February, I believe it's February 7th. I believe it's the date. Yeah. Tuesday, February 7th at Streets. So, yeah. So by the time this broadcasts, it may already be out. So,
well, I'm hoping, I think this is supposed to appear on February 3rd. We'll see. But,
okay. I like that. Yeah.
That's why I tried to schedule you early, David. That's why I was so resistant. Anyway.
Well, some of us have had a rough end to 2022, including surgeries and stuff. So
it's all
I
in love,
appreciate your patience and all of their patience with me as well as we get this engine rolling out of the station, and hopefully with some of the great reviews we've already got, including Publishers Weekly, who gave us a stunning review of this. I'm hoping that this train picks up speed and everybody here is gonna be talking about their stories for awards next year.
All right. So for the audience, definitely check out High Noon at Proxima B. Cliff. Thank you for the correction.
The astronomers say.
Yeah, you can take Sean out of the army, but you can't take the army out of Sean. So anyway, thank you very much. Fine. Check out the book and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Sean, for doing this. Thank you.
And now we bring you Timothy Zahn's Cobra. Earth's only hope was the Cobras. The colony worlds Adirondack and Silvern fell to the Troft forces almost without a struggle. Outnumbered and on the defensive, Earth made a desperate decision. It would attack the aliens not from space, but on the ground, with forces the Trofts did not even suspect. Thus were created the Cobras, a guerrilla force whose weapons were surgically implanted, invisible to the unsuspecting eye, yet undeniably deadly. But power brings temptation, and not all the Cobras could be trusted to fight for Earth alone. Johnny Moreau would learn the uses and abuses of his special abilities and what it truly meant to be a Cobra.
The morning dawned crisp and clear, with only a few scaly cirrus clouds to mar the deep blue sky. To Johnny it seemed wrong somehow that Aventine's sky should appear so cheerful on the day of MacDonald's funeral, and after Johnny's own restless, nightmare-filled sleep. Still, good weather should mean a large turnout at the funeral, and that should draw a lot of Chalonor's Cobras. Perhaps Aventine was on his side after all. Feeling a bit more encouraged, he ate a good breakfast, showered and shaved, and at 8:30 emerged from his house in full Cobra dress uniform. Lest and Tabor, looking as tired as he felt, were waiting for him. "Morning, Moreau," Lest said, looking him up and down. "Neatest I've seen you since the day of the landing." "You're too kind," Johnny said shortly. "Now, if you don't mind, I have a funeral to attend. I'm sure you have somewhere you have to be, too." He stepped between them and stalked down the street. They fell into step on either side and a pace behind him. "There are about 100 places I'd rather be going," Lest said, "and about 1,000 people whose company I'd prefer. But Torres seems to think you need someone to hold your leash." Johnny snorted. Chalonor always did have a way with words. "What the hell are you afraid of? That I'll start a riot or something at Ken's funeral?" "There's no point in taking chances," Tabor said dully. "So far, Ariel's been peaceful. But mass meetings are always potentially explosive. A show of force is the best way to make sure no one gets crazy ideas." Johnny glanced back at him. "You don't sound thoroughly convinced anymore," he suggested. "Chalonor's high-handed methods getting to you?" Tabor was silent for several steps. "I liked MacDonald too," he said finally. "But Chalonor's right. The government here isn't working. There are ways to improve it that don't involve rebellion." "That's enough," Lest interrupted. "The time for talking politics is over." Johnny clamped his jaw tightly, but he really hadn't expected any other reaction. Lest wasn't just going to stand quietly and let him sprinkle extra water on the seeds of uncertainty that Tabor was beginning to show. But maybe, just maybe, there was enough there already for them to sprout on their own. Whether they would do so in time was another question entirely. Not since the last Landing Day festival had Johnny seen the square so crowded. In the center, resting on two waist-high stands, were the open coffins. From the edge of the square, MacDonald's face and folded hands were just visible. Between the coffins, sitting on the only chair in sight, was Father Vitkauskas. Without pausing, Johnny turned to his left, circling the crowd until he was standing in line with the foot of MacDonald's coffin. Looking around, he spotted at least 6 more of Chalonor's Cobras grouped loosely together on the fringes of the crowd near him, their positions obviously having been chosen to take advantage of the slight rise there that would permit a better view of the area. Apparently, Chalonor really was worried about trouble with the crowd. "Good morning, Moreau," a voice murmured behind him. Turning, Johnny saw Chalonor step up next to Lest. "A good turnout, wouldn't you say?" "Very good," Johnny said coldly. "Ken was a very popular person. Killing him was probably one of your biggest mistakes." Chalonor's gaze flicked over the crowd before returning to Johnny. "I trust you won't be foolish enough to try and take advantage of that," he said with the faintest edge to his voice. "Lest, Tabor, and I will be standing behind you the whole time. And if you even look like you're about to make trouble, it'll be the last thing you ever do. And probably the last some of these other people do, too." He glanced significantly at the Cobras standing to either side. "Don't worry," Johnny growled. "I have no intention of starting anything." Abruptly, the low murmur of conversation in the square faded into silence. Turning back, Johnny saw Father Vitkauskas had risen to his feet, and the funeral began. Johnny remembered afterwards very little of what was said that morning. He sang mechanically with the other people when necessary, and bowed his head at the proper times. But mostly his attention was on the crowd, picking out those people he knew best and trying to gauge their mood. Chris and her father he found easily, standing in the front row a quarter of the way around the circle from him. Mayor Tyler was near them, looking grimly dignified, a man determined not to show his shock at the sudden inverting of his world. A lot of the people were wearing that same expression, Johnny noted, and he could hardly blame them. The Cobras, their helpers and protectors, had seemingly turned against them, and no one was quite sure how to react. Some showed more uncertainty than others. Johnny noticed Almo Pyre shifting uneasily from foot to foot. Like Tabor, the teenager seemed to be having second thoughts about the side he'd chosen. A sudden rustle of cloth brought Johnny's attention back to the priest. The service was drawing to a close, he saw, and the crowd was kneeling for the final prayer. Hastily, Johnny dropped to his knees, glancing around as he did so. Chalonor's Cobras were still on their feet, whatever feelings of respect they might have had overridden by the tactical necessity of keeping close watch on the crowd. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Almo hesitate, and then, with a glance in Johnny's direction, kneel with the rest of the people around him. Between the coffin stands, Father Vitkauskas had himself knelt, and as he began the Requiescat, Johnny's eyes sought Chris, saw her hand slip under the hem of her long skirt to the device strapped to her leg, and MacDonald sat up in his coffin. Behind Johnny, someone gasped, but that was all the reaction anyone had time for. MacDonald's hands unfolded themselves, settling smoothly down into what looked like the ready position for a double handshake, and the lasers in his little fingers abruptly spat flame. Tabor, standing directly in the line of fire, crumpled without a sound. Chalonor and Lest, their programmed reflexes finally breaking them free of their astonished paralysis, dodged to either side, raising their own lasers to counterattack. But MacDonald's forearms were already swinging rapidly to his sides, sweeping twin fans of death over the heads of the kneeling crowd. Lest made a choking sound as the beam caught him across the chest and he fell, lasers still firing uselessly at the man he'd already killed once. Chalonor broke off his own attack barely in time to duck down, and fell all the way to the ground as Johnny's anti-armor laser flashed. The rest of the Cobras around the square, their reflexes and targeting locks already keyed to the futile task of avoiding MacDonald's attack, reacted far too slowly to Johnny's entry into the battle. Many, in fact, probably never realized anyone else was shooting at them until it was too late. Between MacDonald's wild spray and Johnny's more accurate sniping, they made a clean sweep. It was over before anyone in the crowd thought to scream. We're not going to be able to keep this secret, you know, Mayor Tyler said, shaking his head. His hands were shaking, too. If nothing else, we, and about a quarter of the towns in Caravel District, for that matter, are going to have to ask the Governor General for new Cobras. That's okay, Johnny said, wincing slightly as Eldjarn applied salve to his shoulder, where a near miss had burned him. No one's going to try and avenge Challenor or pick up where he left off, if that's what you're worried about. All the fence straddlers he said he had standing by will be moving like crazy to make sure they come down on the right side. The warlord movement is dead. He cocked an eye at the mayor. You just make sure your report shows that only a very small minority was involved in the plot. We can't have people getting paranoid about us. There's still too much work on Aventine that only Cobras can do. Tyler nodded and moved toward the door to his private office. Yeah, I just hope Zhu doesn't take the whole thing wrong. I'd hate for Ariel to get stuck with the blame for Challenor's ambition. The door closed behind him and Chris stood up. I suppose I'd better go too. I've got to get busy fixing the phone system. Chris, Johnny hesitated. I'm sorry that had to be done at Ken's funeral, and that you had to see all of that. She smiled wanly. That extra damage? She shook her head. Ken was long gone from that body, Johnny. He couldn't feel those lasers. You were the one I was worried about. I was scared to death you'd be killed, too. Johnny shook his head. There wasn't really much danger of that, he assured her. You, Oren, and Father Vitkauskas set things up perfectly for me. I just hope Ken's reputation doesn't... I don't know. It already has, she sighed. The rumors are already starting to travel out there, to the effect that Ken was faking death so that he could get in one last shot. Johnny grimaced. Yes, that would be what they thought. And within a few days and 100 kilometers, that story would probably be bent completely past recognition. The avenging Cobra, perhaps, who'd returned from the dead to defend his people from oppression. A legend like that might not be all bad, though. It ought to at least slow down future Challenors, he murmured, thinking out loud. I don't think that's something Ken would dislike having attached to his name. Chris shook her head. Maybe. I can't think that far in the future right now. You sure you really feel like working? He asked, studying her strained face. Ned could start the phone repairs alone. I'm all right. She reached for Johnny's hand, squeezed it briefly. I'll see you later, Johnny. And thank you. She left and Johnny sighed. The real thanks goes to you two, he told Eldjarn. The reaction was beginning to hit him, and he suddenly felt very tired. I don't think I could have faced having to wire all those sequential relays to Ken's servos, even if I'd known how to do it. It must have been pretty hard on Chris especially. We all did what we had to, Eldjarn said obliquely. You know, though, that it's not over yet. Not by a long shot. Zhu's going to react to this, all right. If he's smart, part of his reaction will be to start listening to what Cobras have to say on governmental policies and procedures. You'll need to take advantage of the opportunity to offer some good concrete suggestions. Johnny shrugged wearily. I'm like Chris. I can't really think that far ahead right now. Eldjarn shook his head. Chris can get away with that excuse. You can't. As long as there are Cobras on Aventine, the threat of something like this happening again will always be with us. We have to act now to make sure that possibility stays small. Oh, come on, Oren. You're talking politics now, and that's light years out of my experience. I wouldn't even know where to start. You start by making the Cobras feel that an attack on the government is an attack on them personally, Eldjarn said. Ken fought Challenor because the rebellion was an attack on his family pride. You probably had similar reasons. He hesitated. For most of you, I suspect we'll have to appeal to enlightened self-interest. Once your self-interest has been properly linked with the government's. Johnny frowned as understanding began to come. You're suggesting we be brought directly into the government somehow. I think it's inevitable, Eldjarn said. And though his voice was firm, his restless hands indicated his uneasiness. You Cobras have a lot more of the power on this world than the system has taken into account, and one way or another, the system has to adjust to reflect that reality. We either give it to you in a controlled, orderly way, or risk the chaos of Challenor's method. Like it or not, Johnny, you're an important political force now. And your first political responsibility will be to make sure Zhu understands that. For just a second, Johnny grimaced at the irony. Perhaps in a small and unexpected way, Chalinor had won after all. Yes, he sighed. I guess I'll have to.
That was another installment in Timothy Zahn's Cobra. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Praise, thanks, and gratitude to David Boop, Walter John Williams, Hank Schwabel, Brenda Cooper, and Ken Scholes for talking with us today. And good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David F. Shirerod coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.